On January 30th, 1926, the American Eugenics Society incorporated, solidifying their role as leaders of the most formidable, unified American eugenics organization in the nation. The AES board of directors included Harry Laughlin, Henry Fairfield Osborn, Henry E. Crampton, Irving Fisher, Madison Grant, Henry P. Fairchild, and Dr. C. C. Little. These men, and a bounty of women supporters, built a prodigious tract of scientific rhetoric to promote the urgent need for eugenics intervention to call the decline in white births and the increased agency of African American and immigrant populations. The eugenics and hereditarian thought permeated the nation, with instruction meted out within popular vehicles including agricultural societies like the 4-H Club, high school home economics classes, and family planning guides. The overarching theme and goal of AES included coordinating the efforts of the smaller local eugenics groups such as the Galton Society in New York and the Race Betterment Foundation in Battle Creek, Michigan. Grant, a lawyer, poured his fears of Nordic extinction and overpopulation of America by worthless race types into a public treatise, The Passing of a Great Race. He believed AES's efforts in schools, courtrooms, hospitals, and prisons would restore racial balances in a century's time. Grant wrote, "A rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would solve the whole question in 100 years, as well as enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. The individual himself can be nourished, educated, and protected by the community during his lifetime, but the state, through sterilization, must see to it that his line stops with him, or else future generations will be cursed with an ever-increasing load of victims of misguided sentimentalism." The Acumen Group revisits the AES and the historical sentiments of its leaders, the progress and pervasiveness of its efforts, and its legacy 100 years later. Thank you for joining me, Dr. Shantella Sherman, Dr. Sophia Sparks, and Professor Marius Turda as we discuss the 100th anniversary of the official incorporation of the American Eugenics Society.
So my first question goes to Dr. Shantella Sherman. Could you describe the influence and reach of the American Eugenics Society in the United States?
Sure. Understanding that despite the fact that eugenics has had a history that begins almost since the beginning of time, though not formally called eugenics, America's inroads, I guess, with eugenics, its formulation would begin officially around the 1840s. However, it wasn't until we get to about 1926 that there is a trajectory where, with the American Eugenics Society, the belief was that if we could put all of these different organizations that represented eugenics and hereditarian thought under one umbrella, that it would synthesize its dissemination, the dissemination of information, and eugenics would be able to rapidly move into the fabric of foundational organizations. And so with that, I mean things like the National Education Association, Carnegie, our museum systems, our education systems, different universities, our etiquette books, our health and wellness programs. All of them would get some form of eugenics instruction that could be disseminated ad hoc and actually formalized within templates of, this is specifically the information that's being pushed forward. This is how you're going to disseminate it. This is structured for this particular group of people. And so a great example of that would be the introduction of Fitter Families and Better Babies contest that initially came about, again, formalized in 1908, 1910, but then structured more readily under the American Eugenics Society, where state fairs every year in America, where we would have state fairs. Each state had a fair where you would bring in agrarian folks and technology and just talk about the greatness of the state. There would always be a booth that was sponsored by the American Eugenics Society that talked about how to create fitter human beings and better stock in the same way that we did agricultural products or produce, animals, land. Your body was basically the the product, the land, your seed becomes the seed that you would till. And the population, the American product was your body and your children, your offspring. And so it was an amazing feat and effort that the American Eugenics Society pulled all of these different care points together at the same time. But they would go on to, I don't want to say infiltrate, but they would make their way into all types of educational spaces, including medical schools, including the 4-H Club, the Boys and Girls Scouts of America, to basically create a system of selection that the average person, like a sprinkler, whether they were wealthy and elitist, whether they were educated professionals, whether they were working class, or whether they were considered indigent and degenerate, they would all assume some form of eugenics as their day-to-day operating your lifestyle. It becomes a part of the American goal to assimilate and to become a part of this particular rubric, not necessarily understanding that the American Eugenics Society was giving you the leaders for this.
It's interesting that you mentioned the 4-H Club. As a young person, I was actually involved in 4-H. I actually also tried to join Futures Farmers of America, FFA, but I was denied based on my race. They told me I could not join that organization. And they were actually bold and brazen and actually explicitly told me that my color precluded me from joining that group. So that was interesting how you tie those groups back to eugenics, because I did not know that they had any eugenics ties at that time.
You can join the Future Farmers of Romania, Sophia, if you want to. You'll be accepted immediately.
Okay, well, I might look into that. I might look into that.
I'm just saying. So there's always the door is always open for you there.
Okay, I appreciate it. You know, I can learn something. I can learn something. Still learn how to till the land.
Well, and again, I think it goes to just the importance of understanding that this wasn't, it was aggressive in its nature, but not necessarily in its distribution. So this just seemed like a very common sense type of an approach to, farming, and we're going to extend the farming mentality and the tenets of good farming and stock and agriculture into the household itself. And so it seemed almost logical. So there wasn't a real push back against it necessarily. It was, we must protect the greatness of our genes in the same way you would protect a crop. And so it kind of shows you how the average person would embrace eugenics without necessarily understanding the full scope of what it was meant to do.
Yeah. Perhaps the other thing we need to add is that the Eugenics Society, the American Eugenics Society, has only formally dissolved in the early 70s. So that's quite important to see that. So it did continue to exert influence in the post Second World War period. And in fact, in many ways, in terms of its kind of academic credentials, they are more visible and intellectually recognized in the 50s than they were in the 30s. So in the 50s, you have very interesting characters gravitating towards them, almost at the moment when eugenics becomes really a very dirty word, including in the United States. It had by then been more or less transformed or morphed into a toxic word in Europe. that translation has not quite occurred in America until sort of late 70s. However, in the 50s, you could see the American Eugenics Society being very active across the board, from behavioral sciences to population genetics to the old-fashioned toiling of the land, is still called farming in parts of the country.
Oh, yes. And I think, again, Marius, what you start to see is um, the rhetoric doesn't necessarily change, but the targets may. And so by the time we get to the 50s in America, what you're starting to see is the civil rights movement. 1954, you're seeing this explosion of shifts and changes in the law. And so all of a sudden it becomes, if the law of the land now allows the mixture of people, the desegregation of populations, then that old fear all of a sudden has a new ignition. All of a sudden there's a different fear. It's coming alive, where on the ground you can see that if you integrate the schools, you'll integrate the people. And if you integrate the communities and the housing, you integrate the people. And so very slowly that whole fear of genetic annihilation, or as you get Madison Grant talking about the passing of a great race, and the belief that whiteness would simply die out because of these admixtures, or that the excellence and superiority would begin to diminish simply because you now have an infusion of non-white blood, non-white character, and all of these other things. Criminality explodes, and this just basic degeneracy. And so just based on that, it would make sense on the ground that as the civil rights movement is legitimizing and gaining ground, that you would then have this push to suddenly do this all over again, or just let it morph into something else where the targets are slightly different.
I could agree more. And I think probably we should also add, because the American case is quite extraordinary in terms of how religious fervor fits into the rhetoric about uplifting, attainment, atonement, decline, replacement. It's all very kind of, well, we say, for at least here, it's very kind of, evangelical in the terms of, like, it's very prophetic. So, and the role of the churches, and we can see this in the 50s in particular, because you have a big debate about morality and ethics, what would later emerge as bioethics. And you have theologians contributing extensively to the debate, and actually, in many ways, re-endorsing, reinvigorating certain eugenic tropes in the 50s, trying, on the one hand, of course, as you pointed out, to stay clear of full-blown racism, because obviously we're talking about, 1956, it's white supremacy is pushed in the margins, but other things about, intelligence becomes super important. The whole debate about IQ and intelligence and attainment in schools, impossibility of bringing people. Yes, inclusion is important, but ultimately now they have other tools to segregate people, and so on and so forth. And I think that the American example continues to provide us with important lessons, I think. Not just for scholars of eugenics, but in general, in terms of understanding how many things are reconfigured in the 50s and 60s globally, because America by then becomes basically the global actor, pushing, every single possible direction.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thank y'all. This dialogue is already starting off on a very good foot. So this reach from the American Eugenics Society actually stretched into Europe and was welcomed by Romanian eugenicist Dr. Ion Manliu.
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 Yeah, but don't pronounce with the American accent. So it's not man, it's Manliu.
Manliu.
Liu. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay, I'm showing my Americanism here.
You didn't have to mention a Romanian eugenicist. You could have simply very kind of you, Sophia, to try to pronounce the Romanian name. We appreciate it. We appreciate
I'm going to do my best. I'm going to get it till I get it right. Um, but Dr. Turda, could you tell us a little bit about this?
Well, the American example loomed large, and not only in terms of eugenics per se, in other words, experiments with sterilizations, which of course was something that Europeans were absolutely in awe. Uh, Having heard of Dr. Sharp's castration experiments in Indiana, and then the legislation that was introduced in 1907. So the whole debate in America and kind of the push towards coercive sterilization was really admired by most eugenicists in Europe. So you have this level. Another level, of course, is the whole idea of marriage restrictions, which, of course, in America were already introduced in the 1880s in various states across. So that in itself, because obviously people with disabilities, learning disabilities, um, people suffering from various venereal diseases, which were chronic, they weren't allowed to marry. And this sort of regulation existed across the United States already 1880s, 1890s, 1990s. So there was another conversation amongst European geneticists about marriage being so quintessentially important to any eugenic debate, reproduction and family, So there's a second layer, and then you have a third one, which will become quite important in 1920s and 30s, which is basically the segregation laws, the Jim Crow, the whole idea that actually Americans were able to keep the inferior races apart from the whites, which the Europeans increasingly after 1900s and particularly in the interwar period believed that they could adopt to some extent regarding the Jews, regarding the Roma. So this very kind of racist segregationist rhetoric is appealing to them. So you have this kind of multi-layered interaction of various influences that the Europeans and of course this Romanian eugenicist you mentioned, he's quite radical in many ways because he's trained in Germany, so he learns about American eugenics via German eugenicists, particularly through the book of a Hungarian eugenicist who wrote the first book about the history of American eugenics, published in 1913. Hoffmann Geza, or Geza von Hoffmann. He was the Austro-Hungarian consul in Chicago and then in New York. And he was the first to write and produce a bibliography about marriage restriction and eugenics in America, which he published in Germany and influenced profoundly the budding eugenic movement in Germany. He died very young in 1921, but he was a member of the German Eugenics Society as much as of the Hungarian Eugenics Society. In 1912, Man Liu is in Germany studying with some of the important German dermatologists, and he gets to learn about these sort of things. He returns back to Romania and he writes this very radical, almost corporatist American version of eugenics. Everything has to be factorized. In other words, producing factories. You produce healthy babies the same way you produce, motor cars, right? Automobiles. Everything that could be compartmentalized has to be compartmentalized. If it could be, so he gets to that kind of rhetoric, and then he adopts it in terms of ideas of human betterment, improving society through a negative selection, and then he published this. It's one of the first, if not, I possibly we can argue, it's probably the first book on eugenics published in Romanian in 1921, where he basically argues for a wholesome adaptation of the American eugenic program to Romania. So even if you're not aware of how big Romania is or was at the time, but you've got ideas about any European country and you compare any European country to United States of America, you can understand. So the comparison really quite didn't work, but he didn't care about the scale. He was more interested in the motivation. Um, and he was in absolute awe with progress, technology, and of course, America at the time was absolutely the prototype of progress and modernity. So everything from skyscrapers to sterilization programs was something that he thought could help Romania become modern. That's an interesting argument. So what he says is like, You could leave these people from barbarity and backwardness, modernize them, urbanize them, and amongst other things we need to do, eugenics featured quite prominently. So he's one of those who, from early on, becomes enamored with the American eugenics model. In Europe, as you know, there are a number of eugenic models that circulate, at times compete for dominance. It goes to the Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American model, the German model, the French-Italian model. Um, it all depends on the historical circumstances. Religion is very important, of course, Catholicism. But interestingly, Manliu goes for the radical version of this, and America is providing the best example.
Amazing.
Amazing. As I listen to you and Dr. Sherman talk, I just think about how a lot of this information translates, especially into my childhood. Being from South Carolina, there is an island. And on that island, there is a road, and everybody on that road are related. And they don't marry anyone who does not live on that road. So hearing you talk about, the breeding and the marriage, and so there was a law at one point in time in South Carolina where they were trying to limit the breeding of people who were so closely related. And I can just remember my grandmother taking me, like, do not marry or date anybody who comes off of this road. And so it was like wide known.
Don't marry your first cousin.
Not even first cousin, like this person, oh, this is my dad, uncle, cousin. You're like, what?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it was just a whole lot of inbreeding, and it produced a lot of children and offspring who had a whole host of issues. So whenever we would go to the doctors or anything else, you could pick out who was off of that road just by their phonetic features, just because we were like, something's wrong with those people. And they were like, oh, and people would always speculate, like, why are they breeding this way? And there was this whole theory. So hearing you talk about marriage and the offspring just has me thinking about how people actually choose who they're going to marry and what their ideology is behind the type of offspring that will result from their marriage decision. And how eugenics thought about that and was like, hey, let's put some laws or mandates behind this and get people thinking like, hey, if you marry this way, we'll get a better human being, from your.
Yeah, it's interesting. These communities, which they existed in Europe as well, but in America they're quite exemplary in many ways. These cases of interbreeding that eugenicists are absolutely obsessed with because it served their purpose very, very well. They could talk about degeneration at length by illustrating with examples from communities which practice interbreeding or consanguinity in this way, historically speaking. And for then we have the famous case studies that populate the eugenic literature in the United States are basically about communities which are characterized, obviously, amongst other things, through this very peculiar way of intermarrying and keeping everything to the point of basically creating or morphing into, shall we say, like you put it, people with a very distinct phenotype.
Very distinct.
I was looking for a very academic way of saying that.
That was very safe. I like that. But I think again, Dr. Sparks, when you get into that, but you're also looking at is the for us that 1896 law that Plessy versus Ferguson, where you're starting to really push separate but equal. And so, we tend to think in terms of, okay, emancipation comes, but whether it was Abraham Lincoln signing or Jackson and Johnson and all of the other presidents that come behind, the language of emancipation long before it actually took place was, even if you do not believe that these are animals or that Black people should no longer be slaves, you still don't necessarily believe in the equality of the two groups because you're still looking at them as distinctly separate. And so that language of subspecies um, shows itself as early as that 1896 document. Actually, it shows it 1854 with Dred Scott. And so you start to see where the science of it is starting to show itself and then filters into the agricultural and then filters into the science. But there was a theory even that far back that's literally saying these are two different species completely, or one is a subspecies of the other and not fully evolved. And so if you're using that scientific language and then you push that into medicine, it would give you even today the reasons why we're still talking in terms of disease or illness in terms of race. And it's simply, as a scientist, Doc, you already understand this. Diseases, viruses don't know race.
They
They
don't know.
only know bodies and hosts. Exactly. So
That's all they know. They have
exactly.
no minds. They do not think. All they want to do is replicate.
Mm.
They don't
Exactly.
care what they replicate on or in. Does it have the water, the nutrients, the living conditions I need to survive? If it does, that's all it needs. So
Mm.
that
Exactly.
whole notion, I take.
So
I
again, I
have
think
great
that
concerns with that.
so
That just boils me every time.
when you push forward, um, and you think in terms of the infiltration of eugenic thought and theory into the medical community, and then you very slowly look at American history in medical terms, in research terms, what you'll start to see over and over again is that every time a disease, a virus, anything hits America and it's pronounced, the first thing that you do is say in our media, in our medical journals, is this is something that was spawned by immigrants, African Americans, dirt, poor hygiene, ignorance, and it goes back into this entire rubric that pronounces what eugenics is and what it's trying to fight against. So the enemy is not the disease, the enemy is that person who is the facilitator of these diseases. And so that has not stopped. And so that's where you'll see when you have canons and language that's been there in medical practices and housing practices and education practices all of these years, it's hard to break that apart and literally say, okay, now we're going to talk about equality. Well, you can't do that if the principles upon which the organization was founded and its mission in many instances goes directly to that separate, that subspecies, that superiority, inferiority. It's almost impossible to pull it apart unless you first deconstruct the eugenics within it.
See? Great dialogue. Great dialogue, the two of you. Like I say, y'all keep having me
It's
recall
hard to
things
keep
from my
up with.
past.
It's hard to keep up with Dr. Sherman. She's too good for this conversation.
Stop playing.
In that same vein, Dr. Turner, we see the emergence of nationalist theories shaping popular opinion and vice versa through people like, okay, you're gonna help me out with his name, Alexandria. Okay, I'm gonna try it.
Vaida Voivod.
Vida, Vida,
Alexander
Vida
Vaida Voivod.
Vogel.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I can. It's very interesting. Why did you pick up these names?
Because
Um,
because of the Black Notebook, and that's specifically what I would like you to
because
talk
of a
about is the
particular
Black
article
Notebook.
written by a particular person about the Black.
About that Black Notebook and what it meant for the average citizen.
Well, I didn't mean anything because, first of all, no one called it Black Notebook. This is an This is a description that is offered by a current historian because he had black covers, the journal kept by these Romanian politicians. So uh,
Okay.
yeah, it wasn't, and it was a journal. It wasn't published. So the average citizen had no idea what the journal contained. Not even historians actually know because it hasn't been published. So this was found in the archive by a colleague of ours. He's done he was a very important politician, both before 1918, in other words, in Transylvania, which is then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then after 19, in Greater Romania, he was prime minister at some point, had many governmental positions, and he was very anti-Semitic already by 1900s, but in the 1920s, is one of the first official promoters of official anti-Semitism within political parties in Romania. And he was a physician by training. He studied in Vienna. He gravitated around Austro-German eugenicists I mentioned earlier. And then in his journal, he writes about race and he talks about eugenics in this way. And it does publish things about the biological capital of the nation. So for him, the whole discussion after the First World War becomes combined with a new form of nationalism. So this is something that European countries in particular, uh, uh, are promoting after the First World War ethos because of the war on the one hand, but also because of the reconstruction that comes after the war, with many countries in East Central Europe being established. So he's one of those examples of politicians slash physician slash eugenicist who creates a synthesis. He's very eclectic, and he thinks that the new nation states in Europe and in Central Europe in particular should be biopolitical states and dictated or informed by eugenic ideals from the very beginning of their establishment. So we could see this in Czechoslovakia with the Czech eugenicists. We see this in Poland and we see it in Romania. And Vaida Voivod is one example. Um, so in this way, he was influential, of course, through his public lectures and his contribution to the Romanian Eugenics Society, which was established, the first one, established in Cluj by some of his friends. But the Black Notebook, regrettably, is a completely different story. Belongs to a different way of reading the history of eugenics in Romania, and but it's not connected to that particular period in the way you would have probably assumed by its very catchy title.
Okay. That's interesting. Just, that's very well. Just it
I'm
almost
sure after the publication of this conversation, and once it will become famous, so everybody will start talking about the Black Book, the Black Notebook by this Romanian politician as a eugenic text,
I
which in
mean,
fact
just
was never existed.
right. It's like the very American, the thought when the Black Book, it's like, okay, there's this this holy grail of eugenics that this man created, and it's somewhere, and you go, okay, no, that's that's not quite what it was, but okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. All right, Sophia.
Okay, I did not know that the Black Notebook was, a current term. Um,
Yeah,
but I
and
think it's sort of but I think it lends itself to the current times and how we describe things. I think it might be catchy. I might want to reconsider, adopting, that whole title of the Black Notebook and letting it spread. We could go viral with this, and we can bring more people to the eugenics. No, No, y'all don't want to
No,
bring more individuals
no,
into
we're not
these
doing the
people to
anti-eugenics
understand.
project through breaking open the Indiana Jones of breaking open the Black
Exactly.
Notebook. No, it's okay.
Yes.
We're
I
gonna pass.
mean, Indiana Jones had several sequels to Indiana Jones. I mean, so we can really get eugenics, back on the map
The
into the public
anti-eugenics
mainframe.
project. Yes, we're not. It's okay. I think
It's a
we'll.
thought. I would like y'all to, just think on it. Don't make just a rash decision. Just say no off the bat. So I would ask y'all to, give that some thought. Um, so I'm going to shift focus back to America. So the American Eugenics Society pushed for the use of sterilization, immigration restriction, and the isolation of antisocial elements to the population. Your research, Dr. Sherman, actually demonstrate how they were actually quite successful due to the popularization of uplift and assimilation edicts. How did marginalized communities navigate these laws and mandates?
I think that again, it's really really important to stress that even as African Americans specifically were at the root of a lot of the mania surrounding eugenics and race, and just this whole idea of losing the national identity of America because of quote unquote outsiders. And when I say outsiders, I'm not necessarily talking about physical outsiders, I'm talking genetic outsiders. Um, but the reality of it is, if you look at a place like Howard University, which is an historically Black college and university in Washington, D.C., it was founded 1867, and it was specifically designed for the purpose was to educate African Americans, and specifically the children of some of the white males of the nation who had mixed race children, and they wanted these kids educated on a campus where they would be welcome, and they would also receive um, a liberal arts type of education, as well as the rudimentary types of uh, instruction that you would get through agricultural and mechanical universities at that time. You had professors like Kelly Miller, who by the turn of the century was writing eugenics for the Negro, or the eugenics of the Negro. And what he wanted to do was to discuss populations. He wanted to discuss how African Americans, the more educated they became, the fewer children they produced. And he started to create studies on the campus of Howard University where he examined the students and the faculty, that population, and compared them against their parents and grandparents, just looking numerically at the number of children that they were having. And so he was very much in stroke with the the eugenics movement itself. There was very much a platform in many instances where African Americans and immigrants were attempting to assimilate into the country itself. And so you take on the same tenets and beliefs in some instances where you have to determine who are the best products within your group. And so you start to hear things like quantity versus quality. You start to hear conversations about African Americans who are migrating from the South, where education is very limited, into northern and industrial spaces where education is a given. And you start to see that there is disparity and inequality. There's discrimination from within these groups because you're fully assimilating in and you're being accepted. And now you're a part of the quote unquote American dream as much as you can possibly have of it, while at the same time, these other people who happen to look like you, but who are not of your same quote unquote ilk, they're not of your gene pool. They may look like you, but they don't have the same character. They don't have the same quality as far as you're concerned. They don't have the genetic vitality to represent the race. And so we start having issues of colorism and upward mobility. And eugenics becomes tied to education, intellect, and access within the group. And so you do absolutely have individuals and organizations who are fighting tooth and nail against eugenic theories and mandates and the popularity of many of its beliefs. But you also have a large group, I would say by cultural coercion, who are kind of being pushed like a tidal wave into this, whether they want to or not. It becomes issues of respectability. How do we appear in public? How do we dress? How do we speak? How do we talk? How do we stand? Because also remember that eugenics is looking at not just the phrenology of a thing, but I should be able to assess your value to the nation and to the race based upon how you present yourself. So it's even you talking about the people on that road that show up at a particular spot, and everyone in the room can identify them based upon physically how they look. But who is to say within the group, physically they may appear a particular way, but they have all of the character and intellect, and they got the gene power and the vitality, quote unquote, to be on the other side of this room. And so that becomes the internal fight and the internal gaze and the things that you fight about within the group as you're attempting to assimilate into basically a burning building. To use Dr. King's assessment, sometimes you're attempting to integrate into a burning building and you don't really understand that sometimes you're better outside. This is not me giving a whole talk on segregation versus integration. But there are definitely things that were lost in the process of assimilating that at this point I don't believe can be brought back, reassembled, pulled back together. That's a long way around what you asked me, but yes.
Any comments or feedback, Dr. Turda?
Well, it's beautifully put by Dr. Sherman, and I think it's interesting that we could invoke the case of Martin Luther King and some of his wonderfully poetic and philosophical sayings about how we understand the white people. And it's interesting that, regrettably, for some reason, had he lived longer, he would have said something more directly connected to eugenics, because he writes beautifully about white supremacy and how we need to understand that, which I recently just reread for my teaching. This is why I'm not simply dropping a name. I just happen to have read him quite recently again, and I was thirsty for some more from him. Had he gone into that direction, to explain a bit what Dr. Sherman was just saying, how, because obviously they are connected, they are related, and but they're quite distinct sometimes. And certainly there is this preconception, perhaps many African American scholars not know enough about how many of influential leaders, Dr. Sherman has written about it, black leaders had actually believed that maybe eugenics could be one of the solutions that could be used socially and culturally, not necessarily in terms of breeding, but certainly in terms of social education policies, in terms of the uplifting of the black population. There are lessons to be learned from the entire eugenic project. And curiously, in many ways, we don't know much about that side of the story. So I think contribution from this perspective is very welcome, not just for us who know little about it anyway, but including the community itself, which probably needs to know a bit more about that. So that's my only comment to. to what Dr. Sherman had to say about it.
Mm. Well, once again, listening to the two of you, another personal story of how I did not realize that my past had such a eugenic impact. So in my undergrad, I was actually a part of, it's called the Block and Bridle Club, agricultural in nature. I was on that 4-H FAA, trajectory. And in that, I am now realizing how assimilated I was. Because as y'all were talking, I was just, recalling some of the conversations I had with the advisors of the organization and other individuals within the organization. And I can recall them telling me, you act like one of us. I was the only minority, the only one. There was no others, no other groups. I was the only one in that group. And they would always tell me, you don't act like them. You act like one of us.
Mm.
And that was rhetoric I heard quite often. I didn't put two and two together. I didn't think, I had assimilated and everything else. But the more I talk with the two of you, and especially listening to the two of you talk about eugenics, the more I see different eugenic ideologies and impacts from my childhood and how it has literally impacted how I move in my day-to-day life now.
Mm.
So hearing you talk about Howard University and assimilation, I'm like, oh,
I mean,
I've been assimilated.
There's a formulation to just very, very basic things, and some of it seems almost silly. But we would say, Marius, this is something you may not know, and I don't know if it's the same as you were growing up. If there was a Black person who was about to travel, whether you were traveling by car, whether you were walking, you're taking a plane, however you're going, you always dressed. You dressed as if you suit and tie, hat. Women, you had on what they would call your Sunday best. You had on your best clothing. And the belief was if you entered out into the street, you had to present yourself in such a way because you were under Foucault's panoptic gaze. People were always observing you, and you knew that you were being observed. And so you put almost a mask on. You draped yourself in your absolute best so that you could not be judged, and you could not be judged using a eugenic eye. Because we had people who marginalized communities who would walk out into the street and the women would be picked up for prostitution when all they were doing was walking to the bus stop. But the police would say things like, it's the gait of your walk. It's the way that you're walking. It's the way that you're sashaying. It's the way your body is moving that suggests to me that you are a prostitute. And so you learn to structure your behavior, temper your behavior, and how you presented yourself based upon getting to where you're going safely and returning home safely.
Mm.
And so that is a very real thing. Here, going to prison wasn't going to prison. You were locked up if you couldn't pay the fine. Many times you were put on a work farm or you were sent to an asylum. And then from there, you get into the sterilization and the IQ test and all these other things. So you're walking down the street, getting where you're going, making it to your destination and making it home without the cell phones at that time and no pay phones really was about you arming yourself in your best in order to navigate the streets. And so it becomes that surreal where we do it now without really thinking. If you're traveling somewhere, you put on your best clothes. If you're going to the doctor's office, you put on your best clothes.
Yeah. I think
Yeah.
if you want to use an expression made popular by one of your fellow scholars, you were stamped from the beginning.
Yes.
That if you know that important
Yes.
by Kendi, and that's exactly it. I mean, you're absolutely stamped. That's a very good way of describing it with a very powerful word. Notwithstanding how many clothes you put on you, how many ways of avoiding or masking your ethnic origin or your gender orientation, ultimately there was still if they really wanted to, they would still be able to spot you out because they were after
Absolutely.
you. And regrettably, you could see these policies of policing and surveillance, and they are after you. We could see them happening to these days under our own eyes today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
turning to you, Dr. Turda, if the ideology of the eugenics movement in Romania centered around building a stronger, healthier Romania, how did marginalized communities in Transylvania work against sterilization and other injustices if they would have, excuse me, seemed subversive, sorry, I'm reading the wrong thing, or anti-Romanian in nature?
I think every eugenic movement anywhere is aiming to create a healthy nation. So how that nation is defined, obviously, it's a different conversation. But I mean, American eugenicists speak about the American nation or the American race, the racial nation in this way, the Germans. So it's not necessarily something that's specific to a country. This obsession with the healthy family, healthy offspring, healthy race, healthy nation. So in this way, surely, and this happens when you work with ideal types. You have to start eliminating, pruning the trees
Mm.
to reach. Imagine a gardener who's absolutely obsessed with creating the perfect rose, and he keeps pruning the stem and he keeps cutting the leaves and imagine that profound incision in the body of society by taking out what it was perceived to be a minority of ethnic origins, a minority, a religious minority, could have been a sexual minority. In many ways, in countries in Europe where the relationship between ethnic minorities and ethnic majorities were very problematic for historical reasons, and where states were reconfigured after the First World War, then minorities became majorities and majorities became minorities in the new states. So they lost the power, they lost the political dominance. So there was a lot of friction, which was not necessarily racial in nature initially. It turned out quite racial and became racialized in the 30s and 40s. So you could see this in the case of Romania, where of course the Germans of Transylvania or the Hungarians of Transylvania would react quite defensively and try to protect themselves against the biopolitical drive of the Romanian state, which was representing the Romanian majority against the minorities, right? So the minorities were seen as centrifugal forces, detrimental to the ethnic utopia that the Romanian state was trying to create. So you could say they were subversive. So you could speak of a subversive eugenics in this way, which it's ironic because a subversive eugenic would mean that I, as a Hungarian, I marry a Romanian woman, and my only purpose is not because I love her, because I want to undermine the race. So that's a that's a form of now, of course, I very much doubt that historically we could document the intentionality of some of these inter-ethnic marriages that people actually marry so eugenically focused. They marry for the purpose of destroying the other's race. But joking aside, the principle was there. In other words, the Romanians were very keen to prevent intermarriages between Romanians and ethnic minorities. Minorities, in turn, were very keen to preserve their purity by not marrying outside the community or the ethnic group. So there is a form, or we could read this historically in this way. Now, sterilizations, officially, there were no sterilization laws introduced in Romania. We do know of sterilization being carried out by physicians and uh, um, well, both in physicians, both in medical units or in hospitals and clinics and in prisons. We also know haven't been documented fully. It's very hard to see whether this is true or not, that Romanian physicians were trying to sterilize Hungarian women. Whether this is true or not, we don't know. Certainly, we know that Roma women were sterilized. So we have that clearly documented, that the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the Romanians would push that conversation about social selection, control of fertility of certain ethnic groups, would push it through the door of sterilization as well. So it's interesting to see how they resisted, how they fought against. We only recently we started accepting, and I'm talking not just scholars, but also government and population at large started accepting that actually there were a number of selective breeding programs introduced as late as 1980s, early 1990s in Eastern Europe, particularly targeting Roma women. So we only now finding out a bit more about that. And I think the next stage or the next phase in this conversation will be to understand a bit better and highlight forms of resistance to it, because they certainly existed. As you know, the conversation, particularly in East geography, moves first with accepting that something terrible happened, and then by the kind of the logic of things, then comes the second phase, ideally, where we finally understand that there was never a passive victim. There was never someone without agency or not trying to fight back. Even the most horrific totalitarian conditions, then as now, there will always be people who will fight back. And it's the same then. Roma women did fight back, and it's time for us to learn more about them, as much as we want to know, of course, how it happened, how much they suffered, and under which conditions certain eugenic ideas are implemented.
Yeah.
Any comments to that, Dr. Sherman?
Yeah, I think that it's amazing that even though the geography is different, the rhetoric and the hand of eugenics is carrying out things in pretty much the same way. And so again, I always stress that while we're talking about the American Eugenics Society and its 100th that 100th anniversary of its founding, this was in fact a very global movement across the board. And so you'll see the streamlining of these practices. And so it's amazing, and it's daunting because I think that for as many places as you have the same story, and it's a different group of people, but the logic behind it, which is illogical, is agreed upon. And so I think that Dr. Turda is Professor Turda is so very right in saying that it's these individual stories. It's not about trauma porn. It's not about pushing out these very negative stories and they're making people feel bad and all of that. These were or are people's lives. And so the approach that we're attempting specifically with the Acumen group is moving this from the bottom up. I want to hear the voices. I want to hear the stories. I want to understand how this took place from the perspective of the people it happened to and who are living with or are still trying to understand exactly what happened to them. Because once you're in these spaces, it's like someone abusing you, but you cannot leave or you haven't left. In America, it would be an example would be if you're in a space where the town has been ransacked and razed through some type of racist or injustice. Your entire town has been decimated, but you're still technically there. There is no place for you to go. So you're rebuilding, understanding that your neighbor, your doctor, your attorneys, your whoever you had, the person you worked for, these were the people who destroyed what you had. It's the lynching tree for America. It's the Klan. Someone has a hood on, and it's understood that you may have been ironing that Klan robe as the maid. It's the Klansman uncovered, and you realize that's the person who you buy your groceries from. This is the person whose children you watch. But they're, so how do you navigate these systems and this space? And I think that it is so important, however painful it may be for both sides. There has to be a point of conciliation, first and foremost, where we don't try and do revisionist history. But we go straight into this and we actually talk about the fact that we're continuing to do these horrible things through our housing policies, through our prison systems. We're still doing the same types of things. And if we don't get the narratives, those meta narratives from the people impacted by them previously, we don't even know what we're watching going forward. Those who study history get it. But this isn't a cultural events, current events type of situation. This is ongoing. And so I think it's extremely important that, as Marius is saying this, that we engage with eugenics globally. Because the other part of this is by the time we get to like 1959, the American Eugenics Society is holding its international symposium in New York. So people from around the world are coming in 1959. So we've come out of the desegregation process. We've come out of the civil rights. We're going into the actual Civil Rights Act, the 64, 65. But we've gone through the desegregation of the school. So we've gone through 54. We've gone through all of these other things. We've had, to some extent, integrated military but you're still now in 59 introducing or reinvigorating this same thing. And the shift is now about population genetics, psychiatry, and demography. And so you've now stopped talking about it in one frame, but you've simply reframed it. And so now you're talking about population control, and you're talking about genetics, and and psychiatry, and then all of a sudden on the ground you see things where there was a whole push in the 1970s and 1980s that said that Black men were an endangered species. And it's like, who came up with that? And the fact that scholars are writing and psychiatrists are writing and news people are talking to people, because it's like, who came up with this, goobly gop? What is this? But whole narratives and programs were established. And it's like, did anyone die? No, no one even backtracked to say what happened to this whole extinction theory. Well, it was the exact same extinction theory that you had in 1890 that said that by 1900, all Black people in America would just simply wake up dead. So it didn't happen. And so again, we have a task to engage with history so that we don't repeat or don't continue the foolishness. I'm sorry.
I've heard both of you speak about marriage, intermarriage. One thing that I've heard lately, especially on the news, is how interracial couples, now their offspring they get to pick which racial group they get to be a part of. How is that feeding into the whole reframing of eugenics that the both of you have been speaking about?
Well, I think if it's for American society, well, this is a global issue as well, so I shouldn't even say it like that. The there was some fear, and I'm calling it fear baiting once again, fear mongering. The projections a couple of years ago were that beginning in 2024, 80% of all new births globally would come from the global South. That's Black people, brown people. There are all of these, again, population edicts and mandates and this research that's going on that's saying that unfortunately, globally, white people are not reproducing. And when they do reproduce, they're reproducing with brown people. And so if you're looking at this numerically, the fear once again is that there's a global racial annihilation that's coming. We're back to Madison Grant all over again, and this rising tide of color that's coming to sweep out not just the color, but the character of the world at this point. So it's not just the nation, it's the world. And so just the optic of saying majority minority, the majority of the people on the planet are not white. So country by country, this is the conversation that's being had. So if you get to all of a sudden in Texas, have your children who are of mixed parentage determine on a piece of paper, even if they look like you and me, that they are white for statistical purposes, you're not necessarily dying. Okay. And I think that there's something very emotional about fear-driven research. And it's scary to us. It's scary to others as well, because you start to realize that, you're prepared to have people adapt and adjust their race in order that you don't feel a particular way. I think in England, you had an MP talk about status deficit. It's like, how do you define yourself? And I think that this is something that we do need to at some point acknowledge. You cannot identify yourself, your identity formation as a quote unquote white male or female is intrinsically at this point tied to someone who's not you. So if I say define whiteness, how do you define it? And if you tell me I'm smart, I'm beautiful, I'm this, okay, well, other people are also that.
You're not talking about me.
No. Just listen. How do you define? But Marius, I wouldn't do that to you. Like, but how does the average white person define themselves racially? And so what you start to understand is that the way we've backed into a corner, whiteness can't be defined outside of its antithesis. And that's the problem. So if you have no full definition without me or someone else being there, what are Black jobs? Okay, what is beauty? What is creativity? What is, intellect? What is creativity? What are these different things? And what happens if they're in this person's hands as opposed to this one? If you see a white person who can dance, you look like, wow, oh my God, like he has rhythm. Okay, well, yeah, white people have rhythm, but like, what is that? So what does that mean? You understand what I'm saying? These are little slights. They feel like slights, but it's like, this is woven into the way we interact with people. So it is like we can discriminate as well. So it's literally like, what does that mean? Do you not understand that sometimes you have white people living within a very narrow space where they're also being observed? So the first time they're not within that narrow space, someone is calling them out, trying to figure out if they got a Black granddaddy or if they have, what is your true racial identity if you're doing this? So they're also living within a very strict and confined and regimented space that does not afford them true enjoyment in life. And so, how do you win and control things for 400 or 500 years and you're still unhappy and it's still not quite right? and you're still feeling a particular way about other people. You have all the marbles at this point, or you think you do. And so, why are you still anxious about potentially not being here or not controlling things or not? And you're okay. It's okay. But what does that mean, and how do we define that space? I think that we have to get to the true crux of the argument. Do you still believe that there is a racial annihilation that's underway? No one has fell over. White people haven't died. Black people haven't died. Everyone's still here. So what is the fear? And I don't think it can be defined unless we're honest. And until we're ready to be honest, I just don't think that we're going to get out from under this.
Anything to add,
Yeah,
Dr. Turda?
it was said. Not much, to be honest, but I think it's interesting to ask ourselves if, starting from your example, Sophia, if there is a white and a non-white couple, and the child gets to choose which normative identification he or she or they go for, would white be the preference or the choice rather than black or brown? If so, then we could question and understand that whiteness remains still the dominant normative and the attainment for many people. And this is one debate. The other one is, of course, this happens in societies which, notwithstanding current political situation, in societies which more or less have a long tradition of discussing racial identification and empowerment. In other parts of the world, you don't get to choose this. Those children never choose because they're poor, they homeless, they orphan, some of them. So, of course, if you are in Manhattan or in some wealthy neighborhood in Boston or in Washington, and you come from a biracial family, and you are, oh, maybe tomorrow I'll be black, but maybe I'll be white. If you are in a slum, in a favela in Brazil, where they choose for you, notwithstanding how many racial contributions you have to your own makeup. And I think we need to be aware always of that, from which position we are having this conversation. Even in our case, we are still very privileged comparing to other scholars and comparing to other people who actually don't have this luxury to even think about this because the reality of daily life are so brutal that they don't have time to do anything. They need to leave. So, whilst not underscoring the importance of critical thinking in this way, what I'm trying to suggest is that it is relevant to put these examples always in comparison or in context, because in this way we get to understand a bit better how easy it could be for some. Maybe clearly we are very careful. We understand the diversity that goes under this and that goes with this conversation. But there are very well-intended scholars, and you know many, as I do, who don't really see that. And they're very surprised when you tell them you ought to be a bit more careful because obviously you are speaking from a position of authority, privilege, entitlement, and they feel very offended when you tell them this because they don't feel that. But they don't feel it not because they necessarily, arrogant or they are bigots or they're racist. They simply never thought of comparing themselves with other people or other contexts. Because when you start doing that, you realize, well, yes, the situation could be terribly worse if you were to live in South Africa, Nigeria, Albania, Iran, yeah, North Korea, and so on and so forth. So I think we need to put it all together, bring everything together, and then try to exfoliate and unpack what needs to be unpacked and give critical information to people to build on. at the same time retaining a sense of humility and honesty about actually what we're doing here from the confines and comfort of our own homes.
Yeah, that's an amazing point, Dr. Turda. I didn't even, my response now when I think about it, it was very Western. It was very American. It never occurred to me right off the bat that there are a lot of people who simply don't have a choice. It's selected for you, and then you're, conscripted to whatever spaces that delineator sets aside for you. So yes, that's that makes sense. Yes. Yeah. Sophia.
Well,
Right.
today, eugenics is actually rebranding. Um, Rebranding is focused on biopolitics, health outcomes, and the fusion of technology with human capacity or transhumanism. To each of you, has 100 years changed the message or simply the method of improving human stock?
I
I'll
think it would,
start with you, Dr. Sherman.
yeah, I think that it would definitely be a situation where not very much of what began with the eugenics movement has changed. Its mission, its most of its rhetoric. I think the methodologies have new methodologies have been employed. I think new technologies are being used, but that the fact that you have economists and social workers and institutions and um, everyone's just kind of in the fray, with the addition now of people talking about transhumanism and the machines are there in addition to um, just the overwhelming intrusion of the media, social media, in formulating how we think about any and everything in quick 10 to 30-second spurts. Um, there is there is still that call again based on fear, but then also of folks talking about national pride. So nationalism is springing up again, um, very aggressively in a lot of places across the globe, and much of what's being talked about is a loss of footing or a desire to return to um, the old ways. And so there's a romanticism about it. There is and people, um, you become wistful about your childhood and about your grandparents and how they did things, even if you didn't understand why they did things. So no, I think the methodologies have shifted. There are more platforms through which to push the messages. So I would say it's definitely just a shift in that regard, but there are also increased ways of fighting against it. And so I'm extremely pleased that everywhere we touch down, including um, Oxford-Brookes and uh, Cluj and different parts of America and France and anywhere else, that there are people who are actively aware and fighting against the tentacles of eugenics as they move through different platforms.
Mm. Yeah, no, I completely agree. Um, I too believe that the messenger has changed, but the message remains the same. It's like that, a message in the bottle, it's like by the sea of life. It's being carried by currents, sometimes
Mhm.
popping up, sometimes going back. to the bottom of the sea, but always circulating and moving across. And that message is always there. This has not changed much, regrettably, of course. The methodologies may have shifted, and rightly pointed out by Shantella, they have shifted. Indeed, what we see different than, say, 1926 comparing to 2026 is that we're not seeing pockets of resistance. We're seeing movements. We're seeing a global anti-racist solidarity and anti-eugenic solidarity, which in the 1920s did not exist. Of course, you had geneticists or biologists or physicians criticizing from within the discipline various methodologies. Of course, you had racists who were criticized by anti-racists, and so on and so forth. But a globalized ethos did not exist in the way it exists today, notwithstanding the pressure to crush us down, because that exists as well. Some of it driven by racism and the revival of ethnic nationalism and nativism and white supremacists, and some simply driven by the fact that people don't want to lose power. People continue to be obsessed with power, full stop, notwithstanding the color of their skin. Whether we're talking about India or America or Korea or England, even. That thing remains extremely difficult to counter argue, but it is dominant again. And we'll see what the future brings. We won't be around to celebrate or commemorate the 200 years since the creation of the American Eugenics Society. Although maybe the eugenic programs we have been criticizing today will keep one of us alive. I'm looking at you, Sophia, because you're a good example of an intelligent and beautiful human being. And maybe then, if that happens, please remember that 100 years ago, you had this conversation with Dr. Sherman and myself, and tell us, or tell those in the future, what kind of progress has been made or will be made in the next century.
That was an excellent response and an excellent way to conclude today's talk. So I want to thank my two presenters here with me, Dr. and Dr. Sherman. Thank y'all very much for listening to our discussion today about the 100-year celebration of the American Eugenics Society and its global reach and impact.
Thank you.